Welcome. Today's task, we're going to look at the shocks on the UDR. Not really particularly happy with the way this one feels. Suspension just feels dead on it compared to this one. It feels much nicer. So we're going to have a look at the shocks, take them off, at the very least refill them with the correct oil, possibly rebuild the seals, have a look, check there's no leaks, check nothing's bent. But the first task to be able to do that is we've got to remove the body shell. So the 14 or so screws, we'll remove those and take that off. Body shell's now off. Rear shocks, relatively easy to take off. You've got 2 bolts just there, and then 2 bolts. This has got the upgraded aluminium arms with the carbon plates, and 2 bolts there. So they're straightforward enough to take off. So that side is off. Little tip, make sure you know which holes these came out of, because it will affect the suspension on the back. 2 holes, gap there and 2 holes back there. I've just put the screws back in so I know where they go. And again, at the top, I've just put the screws back in so I don't lose them. We'll take the other side off and then we'll have a look at the front. Unfortunately, the front is a little bit more complicated to remove. So the front shock's a little more complicated to remove. You need to remove a screw there, which then enables this frame to move forward. There's then a screw in there. You can actually see I've already removed the one that side. You can see it there. It's a long screw, which you then remove. It then enables these shocks just to pull out like that. Now at the bottom, there's just a small retaining screw there. Very small, that removes. And then behind, I've removed the wheel to make it a little bit easier. You see the little hole there? You can then put something small in there to then remove this pin, which with a pair of pliers you can then remove. It then means both shocks just lift out like that. One of the things I have noticed that might be the problem with this truck is the front diff feels a bit graunchy, but that's for another video. We'll still concentrate on the shocks and see what we've got. Front suspension feels nice and free, so I don't think there's an issue there. So does the rear. It's very heavy, of course, this suspension, but it feels fine. So we'll get the other shocks off, get them onto the bench, and then we'll go from there. So we've got the shocks here on the bench. What we've got here, we've got a selection of oils in a nice 3D printed stand. We've got some solvent cleaner just to clean off at the end, cleaning the oil off. We've also got some tissues because it's going to get to soak the oil up. Shock pliers for removing the ball joints. If you haven't got one of those, you can use a good pair of side cutters just to grip right near the ball stud. Tools in a nice 3D printed stand. If you really want to be accurate, there is a shock measuring tool there where you can bolt them both on and make sure they're exactly the same length. You can use some calipers to measure that distance there. Not critical on these cars, but it will make a small difference. Also a shock pump. Probably not going to use that today because it isn't actually big enough for these shocks, but that makes the process of removing the air from the shocks much quicker when you're using smaller shocks. As standard, the shocks come fitted with 30 weight oil in the front and 60 weight in the rear. And that weight refers to the Traxxas weight oils. When you compare manufacturers on the weight of oils, they vary a little bit. If you go to a Huddy, to Associated, to Core, they all vary a little bit. The only way to get a comparison is to use the CST reference, which 30 weight equates to 350, which we've got some there, which we will put in the front, and 60 weight for the rear equates to 700. Now I've only got some 725, but that's near enough. And again, you'll see the factory team ones say 725 equals their 55 weight. So you've got to be a little bit careful there. Again, for these, it doesn't make too much difference. You'll see the shocks, the front additional damper, which just gives it a little bit more damping, is shorter than the rear. So you need to make sure you don't mix them up when you fit them back on the truck. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to take one of the shocks apart. The process will be exactly the same for all of them. We'll just inspect them. So what we're going to do, we'll look at one of the shocks. First thing you need to do is remove that bolt there to be able to remove the spring retention collar. It comes off pretty easy, and that should slide down like that. Again, we'll give that another bit of a clean. Spring comes off. Springs not broken, damaged, bent. I mean, you don't often get too much damage to springs, but they're fine. And someone on here has put a foam bump stop. Not too convinced about that. We'll probably take that off, and you can see we've got them on some of the other bits. Again, this needs a bit more of a clean up, which we'll do shortly. This shock, in fact, all the shocks are in actually pretty good condition. There's no signs of leaking. If they were leaking, you'd see oil accumulate on the ball joint, or this would just feel all oily, but it's not. Again, the shaft's not scratched. If it's scratched, it tends to leak, and it's not bent. One way you can tell is by eye, but also if it's bent, usually it will be stiff at some point to push in, but it feels fine. So what I'm going to do now, I'm just going to clean this shock up a little bit more, and then we'll remove, or we'll empty the oil out of it. So we've just given this a bit more of a clean up off camera, just with a paintbrush. Just takes off that dirt around the threaded part of the shock body. We're going to empty the old oil into a little container. This is always the interesting bit, to see what colour this oil is. If it's dirty colour, we'll just get tissue to put the shock cap on. Actually doesn't look too bad. So we'll empty that. Oh yeah, it's, and if you can see, that's black. That is really black. So we'll just put that on there. Obviously always discard of your oil properly. And what we will now do is we will remove, what we'll do, let's just put these to one side. I've got a bit more space. We're going to remove this end ball joint. So I'll say we've got these shock pliers, which are perfect for safely removing this without scratching the shock shaft. If you scratch the shock shaft, it will leak. You can use a set of side cutters and clamp it as close as you can to the thread, just so you don't scratch it. So we're now going to remove that. I'm not going to put that back on. Remove that. As you can see, there is the piston. So we'll leave that just to drain. So here is our piston. You can see we've got a little tissue container there, 3D printed, always handy. You can see from the colour of this oil, that oil's never been changed, I would say. So this is one of the front shocks, which we're going to put in the 350 oil. See in there, it looks okay. To replace the seals, just unscrew that, and you then have, I'm actually not going to take these out because I'm happy with those. If I take them out, I'm just going to disturb them. There's basically a washer, sorry, there's an O-ring, a washer, and then an O-ring. When you're putting them together, make sure you put plenty of oil in there, because you don't want to, you want them to seat properly, and you don't want them to get scratched when you pass the shock shaft through. You can use a little bit of grease. In fact, the best stuff, I haven't got any on my desk at the moment, on my work table at the moment, is the associated green slime. It's like a green grease. That is some of the best stuff to use. So we are going to use this oil. I'm going to pass this shaft, which I'm happy, it's clean, it's straight. I'm going to put some oil on the end of there, reasonable amount on there. And the tip that I've found, when you're passing this through here, don't push it straight through. Once you find it starts to go home, if you can, just turn it. Once it comes through a little bit like that, if you can grab hold of that and turn it, so you're actually almost like threading it through. If you just push it straight through, that is when you will damage your shock seals and it will leak. So, little tip I've also found is try and keep things as clean and tidy as possible when you're doing this. So 3D printed stand is great for using this to retain the shocks in when you're doing something like this. It gives a nice stand. You can got eight compartments on this stand, 3D printed by ourselves, so you can keep all your shocks in here when you're rebuilding them. So we're going to fill this with this oil, use the correct oil, otherwise it won't handle it very well. Fill this almost to the top. There we go. And then what you want to do is you want to work this piston up and down a few times to work out any air bubbles. And then what I will do is I will leave that in there for all the air bubbles to naturally rise to the top, and then you can continue with the next steps. As I say, if the shocks are a little bit smaller, we can use these shock pumps which evacuate, but basically creates a vacuum and it sucks the air bubbles out, but unfortunately they won't fit in that shock pump that I've got there. So what I would normally do now is put this to one side, and then I'll have a look at the next shock. I'm not going to record that because it's going to be exactly the same process for doing with these, or whether it's the rear shocks, it's all going to be exactly the same process. So we have left this for a few minutes just for the oil to, for the air bubbles in the oil to come to the surface. And what we're going to do now, I'll just move that piston up about halfway. I'll show you why in a minute. This is where it's likely to get a little messy. If you put the cap on, it will, some of the oil will squirt out. If you then, that then goes over the top, and you'll see the oil will now start to squeeze out. You'll see there's a little bleed hole there. Do it up just a little, good hand tight. Give it a clean with the tissue. And then you can feel that, that feels so much better. We've actually got zero rebound on this shock. What you can sometimes do is when you push the piston in, it will come out a little way. I'm not going to worry about rebound on this shock. What you can also do, a little bit of, this is just a solvent cleaner, something such similar. We'll just take off the oil, any residue of oil. We then need to obviously put our bottom ball joint back on. Again, if you haven't got shock pliers, just use some side cutters as close as you can get them to the thread. And if we then compare that, we can just check the lengths. They're the same. You could measure it, whatever you want. You feel that, it feels nice and smooth. Don't know if you can hear that one. It feels very, it's notchy, it's squelchy, it's not right. So then to put the spring back on, simple as that. The nut then needs to, sorry, the retaining lug, as you should say, needs to line up with that. And then you just use, put that screw in. You need to do this, otherwise you may lose this, it may come off. And that is that done up. So that is a shock rebuild done. Another 7 more to do if you want to do them. I'm actually not going to touch the separate dampers because they don't feel too bad. But I will go through and rebuild the rest of them and put them back on the vehicle and see how it goes. So we now have 8 new shock absorbers cleaned. The full shock absorbers I have actually rebuilt. We've put new oil in them. I haven't actually put new oil in these because they actually felt okay, and we'll do that another day. But it's exactly the same process, exactly the same process. You can see this is the oil. It's black, it is completely black. That's the oil that came out of the shocks. These have slightly different springs front and rear. The ones at the front have 2 marks on them. I'm not sure the exact differences. The rears look slightly stiffer. They are actually rising rate springs, so the more you compress them, the stiffer they get. You can tell that by the fact that the coils are not evenly spaced, so they are rising rate springs. This does not adjust how stiff the spring is. It only adjusts the ride height. So that's what we use to adjust the ride height. One of the things I noticed when I was actually rebuilding these shocks, they actually felt a little underdamped, i.e. they feel very springy. But of course, you've got another damper, so effectively you've got 2 dampers and only 1 spring, so that should all sort itself out. So we've got it all back together, shocks back on. Make sure you get them in the same hole, both sides, if you've got adjustable arms like these. And I'm not particularly impressed with the front shock mount. It's pretty poor the way it goes in, just with a long screw, no spacer or anything, but I suppose it does the job. One little thing to note is when this pin goes through here, make sure you push it back all the way. You shouldn't be able to see it from the front. That screw then, you see that screw there, goes down and stops it from coming out. But just a simple, just feeling it, it just feels better. It just feels more supple. I don't know what the words are, but it'll be interesting to see. We'll give it a go and see how much it improves the handling. As you may have seen in parts of the video, we do have a broken front anti-roll bar. I have got some spares that I can put on, and that'll be the next video. But that's going to have an effect. It's going to make it roll. As you may know, anti-roll bars stop it doing so much of that side to side, and obviously these cars are quite prone to flipping over. But body back on and we'll give it a test. Little tip, this is one of the things that I used when I was cleaning up my shocks off camera. It's slightly stiffer than a little normal paintbrush, but it's not like a wire brush, although it came in a pack, I think, from Screwfix or somewhere. But that's really good. It just gets into all these little threaded parts and it cleans it up. So we'll put the body shell back on and see. So the body shell's back on and it's looking good. I was a little bit confused why we've got heavier weight oil in the back compared to the front, but I can now see the logic. Because you've got the shocks mount a long way up here on the arm, because of mechanical advantage, it needs to be heavier. If it was a lighter oil, generally you always run the back of a car softer than the front, otherwise it will just grip roll, oversteer, whatever. But because of the suspension geometry on these, you need it to be, and you can feel it. In actual fact, it does feel softer on the rear than the front. One last thing, obviously 3D printed items is the bag. Stand there, which we've used many times in this video. We've also got a sacrificial roof protector there. I'm going to have a video on how we've done that and how that's fitted. It is very much sacrificial, but it's much cheaper than destroying your body or breaking your body. But hope that's been interesting. Next video is probably going to be fixing that front anti-roll bar, and I think we'll probably have a look at the front diff at some point. Thanks very much.